Good evening. We're thrilled to have you here tonight. Thank you for joining with us for this session. As we gather together tonight, we're coming excited and with a great anticipation of seeing how God has already worked in these last few days here on this island. I'm just excited to see how we as churches have come together in unity to join with the central theme of the gospel, and that just thrills my heart to see that desire from many of us that we share the gospel of Christ. And so that's why we're here tonight, to know how to do that better, how to show forth Christ in a loving and compassionate way. And I'm excited about learning new tools for enabling us along those lines. As we get started tonight, my name is Pastor Bob Fisher. I'm the pastor here at the church, and I just want to take just a moment. This is really a vision that has been born for many years out of a dream that Zach Monis had to bring someone from RZIM here on the island, and all that you've seen, and if you've been to any of the sessions and as it's been unfolded, both he and his wife Christina have done an amazing job to orchestrate all this, and I want to give them a real round of applause. And they're both true servants. They won't let us do anything. That's the funny part about it. In fact, if you don't believe me, just turn around. He's running sound now, okay? So anyhow, we're so thankful for them. Let's have a word of prayer to begin with, and then I'm going to turn it right over to Michael as we do this tonight. Lord Jesus, we want to praise your name. You are high and lifted up in all of this world. Your name and praise will go forth, and if we do not do it, the rocks themselves will cry out. Father, we want to be faithful in what you have called us to do. We want to do it in a way that shows forth the example of Christ, reaching down to those that were destitute, that were poor, that were not ones that we would readily approach, those that were in need, those that thought they had all the answers but did not. And he went with a loving and kind and gentle way to be able to share with them the hope that they could have of being regenerated, of having a restored relationship that was broken with God. Thank you for Jesus Christ. Thank you for the gospel. And Lord, as we hear tonight in this place, may it permeate our hearts and minds to be able to do a better job in what we do. And so we'll give you the praise for that in Jesus' name. Amen. Now today, what we're going to do is Michael will come and speak for a few moments. In front of you, in the seats, you will see in the little container there's a card. If you want to reach out and get that as Michael is speaking and it stirs something in your mind that you might want to ask a question, you might just want to write that down. I know many of you are not, you're used to being able to talk and speak in front of people, and so you're not afraid of the microphone. So we will have some roving microphones as well. But I would just encourage you to kind of write down your question, and that'll keep it concise, and then we will gather some of those as well as allow you to be able to share that if you feel so inclined to do so. So Michael, let's give a big hand to Michael as he comes to speak to us.
Good to be able to see you. And actually, what I want to try and do this evening, if I can do this well, is I'd like to try to get you answering some of the questions that you yourself will be asking. So when we go into the second part of this, we're going to try and apply some of what we're going to be talking about in the first part into the second part. So I'd like you to imagine the following. I'd like you to imagine you're talking to someone who isn't a Christian. You are a Christian, and the conversation is going really, really well. You're really enjoying it. It's great. You can't believe even yourself how good you are in terms of the things you're saying. It seems to be incredibly helpful. And then I'd like you to imagine they pause at one point and they look at you and they say, well, wait a minute, what about this? And then they ask you the question, that you're dreading to be asked? What is the one question you would least like to be asked by someone who isn't a Christian? What is the question that would get you praying for the second coming? Because Armageddon would be preferable to having to answer that. So what I'd like you to do is try to give some thought, does that make sense, to those kinds of questions. And we're going to try and gather in some of those questions after I finish speaking. And then we're going to start to think, how do we actually learn ourselves to think clearly and apply what we'll be talking about in the first bit during that second time? So I hope that makes sense. That way, hopefully, things that are shared here, you won't simply just forget, and it won't just go into the ether. Application always helps. Just bury it a little bit deeper in your heart and mind. Now, some of the things I'll be sharing with you, actually what I'll be doing with you now is the very first session, which is now part of something which we call our online academy. So if you're intrigued by this evening, you find what's being said helpful, and you'd like to go more, if you go to the RZIM website and you look about the RZIM Academy, then you will see that we run an online course, which you actually do. There's like a moderated discussion that happens once a week. They take people around the world, they put them in the same time, kind of roughly the same time zone, so people can have access to it. And if that will be something that will be useful to you, then by all means either come and speak to Jim Wigglesworth here at the front or Bob Grinnell, and they will be able to give you all of that information. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to frame the remarks I want to make out of you out of a book in the Bible called 1 Peter chapter 3, and I'll be coming to that in a minute. But let me just start with a little personal word of introduction about what we'll be trying to do here. Many years ago, when my wife and I were living up in the north of England, we now live sort of way further south, but when we were living further north, we lived in a small ex-coal mining community just outside a city called Sheffield, which had a very high unemployment rate. Unemployment was running about 25%. I don't know if you've seen ex-coal mining towns. You get, in England, we call them slag heaps. I don't know if you have that term here. It's all the dust that you can't sell. It gets piled up in big mounds. Eventually some kind of stuff grows on it, but not a lot. And that's where we lived and based when we first started our married life together. And while we were living there, I got invited to go and come and speak over in America. And I didn't really know very much about America at all at that point. I'd lived most of my life in the Middle East and in Europe. But the one thing I knew about America was if I was going to go and speak in America, is there were two basic conditions that had to be fulfilled. Otherwise, I had no chance of connecting with the audience. And that's namely that I needed to have good hair and good teeth. Now, the teeth thing is a much more expensive thing to fix, and that's a long-term thing, and I wasn't in a position to do anything about that. But back then, I used to let my hair grow so thick and fast that I knew it was time to have a haircut when I could no longer get a comb through it. And I'd now hit that no-comb stage, and so I thought I better get a haircut before I fly out to the States. And the little street that we lived on, at the end of it, there was a small hairdressing salon called Belinda's. And I'd never been in there before, and I was thinking I desperately need a haircut, but I know they cut hair down there, so I just walked 100 yards down the road. Do you use yards here or meters? Yards is okay? Yeah, so 100 yards down the road. I was going to say you can have it in meters, except I don't know how to convert it. And I just walked into this small hairdressing salon, and there was a very tall, very pregnant blonde lady standing behind a small welcome desk, and she said, "Can I help you?" And I said, "Yeah, sure, I would like a haircut, please." And she produced a small little appointment book and a pen, and she said, "When were you thinking of coming?" And I said, "Well, now." And she looked at me, and she looked at her book, and she said, "You know what, if I'm quick, I can fit you in." I said, "That's not a problem. I don't have hairstyle. I just have hair, and it needs to be much shorter than it is now." So she walked me and put me in a chair. She put a big apron around me, and she walked off, and she picked up a comb and scissors. And as she came and stood behind me to cut my hair, she turned to the lady who was cutting hair next to me, and she said, "You know, my business is doing so well, but there must be more to life than this." And then she turned back to cut my hair. And so I was intrigued by the comment that she'd made to her colleague. And so now there's a big mirror in front of me, so I just look in the mirror and I catch her eye because she's standing right behind me. And I said to her, "You know, what you say I think is very true. In life, we're not made happy by what we acquire, but by what we appreciate." And she just stood still for a moment and looked at me, and she said, "What did you say?" I said, "In life, I don't think we're made happy by what we acquire, but by what we appreciate." And she walked off, and she came back with the appointment book and a pen, and she said, "Could you repeat that one more time?" And she wrote it down in her little book, and she put the book down and the pen down, and she picked up the comb and the scissors. But, since she seemed to be interested, I thought I'd follow through, and I just said, but if you ask me, the trouble we have today is not that we have nothing to be grateful for, rather we feel there's no one to be grateful to. And she put down the comb and the scissors, and she picked up the book and the pen, and she said, could you say that one more time? Now, it took her over an hour and 15 minutes to cut my hair. Since she seemed to appreciate that comment too, I'd actually been preparing a message to speak in my local church that Sunday about worship, and I'd been reading some C.S. Lewis about worship, and I borrowed an illustration from him, and I said, have you ever been in love with someone and unable to tell them? And she said, I have. I said, it's a terrible feeling, isn't it? I said, but if you are able to tell someone that you love them and it's reciprocated back to you, it brings a completeness that simply wasn't there before. She said, I know exactly what you mean. I said, well, that's why to me as a Christian, worship is so important. It brings a completeness to my life that otherwise would be missing. And I say she was very obviously pregnant, this lady, so at this point she sort of sighed a little bit, and then she said, Michael, I'm just so worried about bringing a baby into a world that's filled with so much evil. And again, borrowing a line I'd actually heard from my boss, Rabbi Zacharias, who borrowed it from a friend that he heard it from, I said to her, look, I know there's a lot of evil out there, but what about the evil that exists in here? And then she said, if there was a way to overcome evil in the human heart, that would be amazing. I said, it's interesting that you say that. I said, it feels like there's something inside of us. We're all trying to be the best person we can, but we don't seem to get very far. She said, I know exactly what you mean. She said, I'm trying to change, but I can't. I said, well, the Bible calls that sin. Sin isn't just something that we do. It describes a power that seems to have control over her life. And she said, I feel like I need to be rescued. So I looked at her and I said, what you're telling me is you need a savior. And I'm not joking. She went, ooh, that's a good word. Because, you think outside of church, how often do you use that word? I mean, you don't use it very often. I said, what you're telling me is you need a savior. She said, ooh, that's a good word. And then we began talking about how Jesus Christ came into this world and he was free of the law of sin and death because he was perfect. He was God made man. And how he went to the cross and he became sin for us. And we talked about his death and his resurrection and how that can change your life. And then she said, and then she said to me, do you think God changes lives today? So I actually told her a story. I'd been speaking with a guy called Chuck Colson, who some of you will know, just before then. And I said, I was with this guy, Chuck Colson, and he was telling me this story about a guy on death row who became a Christian, and after he became a Christian, he instructed his lawyers to withdraw his insanity plea because he was arguing against his death penalty on the basis that he was insane. And after he became a Christian, he said to his defense lawyers, I can't argue this anymore. I knew exactly what I was doing. Everything was premeditated and pre-planned. And as a Christian, I'm not prepared to lie anymore. And this man actually stood up in the Supreme Court of the United States, in the U.S. Supreme Court, and argued this. And you know what they ruled? Only a crazy person would do such a thing. And so, they didn't kill him. He was still alive, and he was sharing his newfound faith. And then she said, that's amazing. Has God changed your life? So then I shared my testimony. And then she said, well, what should I do about this? And I said, well, you can't sit on the fence forever. You're going to have to make up your mind. Who is Jesus Christ? Is he really who he claims to be? And when I went home, I told my wife about the conversation I had, and we got down and we prayed for this lady, and I went off to the States. And when I came back, I thought, I'd like to see her again to pick up the conversation. And I was thinking, how can I do that? So 2 weeks later, I went back for a second haircut. Now, this is the shortest hair I've ever had in my whole life. When I walked into her little hairdressing salon, she didn't even ask if I wanted a haircut. As I walked in, she said, Michael, I will cut your hair. She walked me across and sat me in a chair. And then she stood behind me, looked at me, and she said, do you remember the conversation we had 2 weeks ago? And I said, yeah, I sort of remember what you said. And she said, well, I went home and I told my husband everything you told me. And I thought, well, this is going to be interesting. So I looked at her and I said, well, what did your husband say? And this very funny expression came over her face. And she said, he told me I was preaching at him. Well, of course she was preaching at him. They both get home from work. They sit down at the dinner table. Out comes the notebook. Do you know in life you're not made happy by what you acquire, but by what you appreciate? It's not that you have nothing to be grateful for. You have no one to be grateful to. That's why worship is so important. There's a lot of evil out there, but what about the evil in here? There's nothing you can do about it. It's called sin. That's why you need a savior. She seems to be so open while we're talking, and he appears to be so closed. And the question is, why? And the answer is, she was asking a question. That statement, there must be more to life than this, it's not really a statement, it's a cry of the heart. It's a question. Is this it? Or is there anything more to it than this? And that way, I learned a radical new way of sharing my faith with other people, sharing my faith. It's called talking to people. And this radical idea of learning to talk to people is basically what we're going to be looking at this evening. Now, there's a well-known verse in the Bible, if you're interested in apologetics, and it comes up in the book of 1 Peter chapter 3. And it says this. In verse 15, it says, "But in your heart set apart Christ as Lord, and always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander." Now, that is a fascinating set of words. And so what I want to do is I want to just look at exactly what that's saying, what that means, and how that applies into our world today. Now, sadly for you guys, because I was never sent to a professional seminary to be trained how to preach 3-point sermons, I've got 7 main points. My third point subdivides into 8 subpoints, and I have 3 introductory remarks. This is because I did a degree in law, and that's basically how you write statutes. Okay, so so if you wanted the 3-pointer, you're definitely in the wrong place tonight. Okay, we've got a lot more than that. Now, let me just start off by making a few introductory remarks. The book of 1 Peter is addressed to the church. If you read 1 Peter chapter 1, the first couple of verses, that letter is a letter written to the church, not to a certain geographical area, but it's actually written to the church that's now being scattered and spread right across the world in many different countries. So this is a general letter. Does that make sense? To everybody. It's a general letter to every Christian everywhere. And in that general letter, it says, hey, if you're a Christian, you need to be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that you have. In other words, this command is not given to a group of specialists. Does that make sense? It's not given to 1 or 2 bright people who happen to go off and get multiple degrees. Peter envisions that every Christian, when asked the question, why do you believe what you believe, is able to give an answer. So here's my first question to you. Can you? Have you ever noticed that when many Christians are asked, why do you believe what you believe, why are you a Christian, they respond by saying how they became a Christian. Have you ever noticed that? But why you are a Christian and how you became one are 2 slightly different things. If someone is asking you, so why are you a Christian, and you tell them how you became a Christian, well, you're answering a different question. You say, well, I met these nice people, and they were very kind to me, and they invited me along to their church, and then they went away for a weekend, and I went with them, and during that time, I became a Christian. Now, I want all of you to stop thinking like Christians for a minute and think like good pagans. What does that sound like? Now, feel free to be Pentecostal and feed back to me here now. What does that sound like? Well, I met these people, they were very nice to me, they invited me to my church, they took me away for a weekend, and I became a Christian. Pardon? It sounds like you joined a cult, right? It sounds like you've been brainwashed. I have a friend, and after he was converted, his mother said to him, John, you've been brainwashed. And he said to his mother, Mother, if you knew it was in my brain, you'll be glad it's been washed. Now, and doesn't it also sound very much like chance? You just happened to meet a Christian that day. If you met a Buddhist, they would have invited you to their temple. You'd have done just Zen, and you would have gone away on their weekend away, and you'll be a Buddhist, right? Does that explain what Christian conversion is? It's sort of chance and brainwashing. You mix them together, and you get Christians every time. It's important that all of us learn to answer the question, why? Why are you a Christian? What is the answer to that question? It's a good question. It's a very fair one. So first of all, this letter is addressed to everybody. Does that make sense? This is something that is for all. Now, the other thing that you'll notice, if you read the beginning of chapter 1 of 1 Peter, of that book of 1 Peter, is that it is addressed to a church that's been persecuted. The church has been scattered. Why has the church been scattered? Well, they all met together in Jerusalem. Persecution came to Jerusalem. And as a result of the persecution, they had to flee the persecution because they were being either killed or put in prison. So they went to lots of other neighboring countries. So this command, you be ready to speak up for your Christian faith, is a command given to a group of people who could lose their life for doing this. Now, a lot of Christians today, they say, well, I don't really talk about my faith. It's a little bit embarrassing, or, I'm worried about, causing trouble, amongst whoever it may be. The trouble with that excuse is that when you get to heaven, you're going to meet a whole bunch of people who were killed for doing this. And the excuse that we have, well, I felt a little bit embarrassed at the time, isn't going to sound quite so convincing as we feel it does right here and now. So the second thing is this command is given to a church that's being persecuted. Now, the third thing to note is, just before we get into 1 Peter 3, verses 15 and 16, the immediate context of this command is all about holiness. If you read the verses around it, it says this. It says, who's going to harm you if you are eager to do good? But even if you suffer for what is doing good, you shall be blessed. Do not fear their threats, and do not be frightened. In your hearts revere Christ as Lord, and always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks. Now, isn't that interesting? Just before that, it says, do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. The immediate command, for this command, you be ready to give an answer, is about holiness. That's the immediate context for this command. So there's an assumption here. Hey, because you're leading a life that makes it clear that you follow Christ, because you're leading a holy life, people will ask you questions. Now, people sometimes come to me and they say, but Michael, nobody asks me questions. And there's a really difficult answer back to that, which is something like this. Well, what does your life look like? That's where we start. Peter assumes if you're really living for Christ, your life will look different. And because your life looks different and you act differently, people will ask you why you're like that. In the book of 2 Corinthians, it says that Christians are living letters known and read by everybody. What does your life say about Jesus Christ? I mean, as people read the pages of your life, what does it actually say about him? Does it call forth questions from other people where they say, what's going on with you? Why does your life look so different? Now, these are the three introductory remarks I wanted to make to you. What we're about to study and read here in some detail is an instruction that's given to all Christians everywhere. It's an instruction that's given to people who could be persecuted for their faith. And it's coming in the context of holiness. Does that make sense? Because you're living the right in a certain way, people will ask you questions as a result. So don't be surprised when people ask you questions. So now I want to just look at this verse in particular. Right? In your heart, set apart Christ as Lord. Now, the Greek word translated heart there is cardia. It means the center of what you think and feel. Make sense? So when they talked about your heart, they didn't simply mean how you feel or the physical organ that pumps blood. It meant like the heart of you. Make sense? The heart of your person. What you think and what you feel. So in your heart, right in the very center of who you are, the first thing you need to do is make sure that you know Jesus Christ and he is enthroned as Lord over all of your life. How you think, how you feel, how you act, he has to be Lord over who you are. It's not always easy to deal with some people's questions. Sometimes people feel upset when they're asking their questions. Sometimes the confusion runs deep. Sometimes they feel massively disappointed. Sometimes they think they're being misled. It's not always easy to put yourself on the other side of that. So before we engage in that, we need to make sure our own heart is right with God. We fully submit ourselves to him. To give an answer for the reason for the hope that you have is to engage in a spiritual battle. So we better make sure that we're both right with God and that we're working through the guidance of his Holy Spirit as we do this. So first of all, this is the first main point. Make sure Jesus Christ is at the center of your life, that he is Lord over your heart. Secondly, it says that we should be prepared. Now, that Greek word to get prepared carries with it the idea of getting physically fit. Now, I've always dreamed of being physically fit. I can remember a while, many, many years ago, I once exercised for one whole week in order to look like Arnold Schwarzenegger. I stood in front of the mirror, and there was no discernible physical difference. Now, the trouble with getting fit is it takes continual hard work. That's the hard thing about getting fit. Out of interest, how many of you here have a degree? Just put up your hand if you do. Okay, now, keep your hand in the air if today you could sit the finals for your degree and still pass them. Oh, now, you see, look, most hands have gone down. Have you noticed that? You see, getting degrees is easy. You learn largely a bunch of irrelevant information, unless you're a doctor or a nurse, in which case I hope you have remembered what you were taught at university. You sit exams on it, you get your piece of paper, and then you promptly forget everything you were taught. I mean, how many people would even bother getting degrees if after 10 years the university or college came back to you and said, hey, to keep the degree you have to resit all your exams again? Most people wouldn't bother in the first place. But here's the important thing. You keep the degree even after you've lost the content of the knowledge. But getting physically fit is totally different. I mean, you can spend years in physical training. You can get as fit as you possibly can, and then when you've achieved the peak of physical fitness, can you kick back and order as much pizza and beer as you want? Okay, that's not how it works. It's something which is lost. So when Peter says here, you need to be prepared to do this, he's anticipating a command that takes continual hard work. You're going to have to work at it. You're going to have to keep working at it. You have to keep on working at it. It is not going to be easy. It's not something that you just do once, forget about, and then you've done it. So this isn't something which is as straightforward as we would like. It's actually at times much harder than we like to think. Now, the third word I just want to look at briefly with you is it says, in your heart, set apart Christ as Lord, and always be prepared. That was the second one. Thirdly, to give an answer. Now, in the language that the letter of Peter was written in, the word translated answer there is a Greek word, apologia. It's where we get the English word apologetic from. It means to give like a reasoned defense. It's a legal term. Okay? An apologetic is what is given by a defense lawyer on behalf of their client. Now, this is where we need to expand things just a little bit. Because apologetics is not just, therefore, about giving answers to other people's questions. That's not simply what defense lawyers do. Defense lawyers also ask questions of other people's answers, or they even ask questions of the question itself. Do you want me to say that again? Apologetics is not just about giving answers to other people's questions. It's also about learning to question other people's answers, or even question the question itself. Now, when I became a Christian, having lived most of my life in the Middle East, I became a Christian. For me, there was a very definite time when I became a Christian. It happened on one Saturday evening. And on Tuesday, the following Tuesday, I was going off to my first ever Bible study. And by that point, I'd read through the New Testament twice. I was just desperate I was so interested to read the Bible. But I was a bit worried by the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, sometimes when people hear my British accent, even in England, I was speaking in England last week, and someone came up to me and said, where's your English accent from? Because they find it hard to place. And the reason is I didn't learn this English accent in England. This is the voice of the BBC World Service. Okay? That's the accent that you're listening to. And I used to love listening to the BBC World Service when I lived in the Middle East. And they would interview political leaders all of the time. But I used to hate those interviews, because the interviewer would ask them a really good question, and they would answer a totally different question. I'm sure that never happens here in Bermuda. But, these political leaders, whatever question you ask them, they would ask another question, and then the interviewer would say, well, with respect, Mr. President or Prime Minister or whatever, you didn't ask my question. So then he would ask the question again. And then they'd answer another question. Now, I was a brand new believer, and I was reading through the Gospels, and every time someone came up to Jesus and asked him a question, he seemed to be answering a different one. And I can remember by that Tuesday, having now read through the Gospels twice, I was like, Jesus is a politician. What on earth is going on here? Well, I've now been studying those Gospels for over 30 years, and I now realize that he wasn't doing that at all. What you very often notice is that Jesus Christ answers a question with a question. Now, the question is, why? Someone once asked a rabbi, Rabbi, why do you always answer a question with a question? To which he said, why shouldn't I answer a question with a question? Now, asking questions does a lot of things, and this is going to go right to the heart of what we're going to be looking at tonight. Let me suggest to you at least 7 or 8, let's see how much we have time for, about why Jesus did this. Firstly, asking questions gets people to open up within their general assumptions. So, in Luke chapter 18, someone comes to Jesus and says, good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Now, there's a good question. Okay? How do I get to heaven? Now, what's the answer to that question? Does anybody know? Why? How do you get to heaven? What is the answer to that question? Okay, something to do with repent and believe. Well done. Okay, it's got something to do with Jesus. I'm going to give you a clue right now. We're in church. Almost any question I ask you, the answer is going to be Jesus. Okay, so you need to trust Jesus Christ, right? That we all know that is the answer to that question. Now, so here's the next thing. Why doesn't Jesus say that? In Luke 18:18, why doesn't he look at this guy and say, well, what you need to do is repent of your sin and believe in me? Is it that Jesus Christ didn't understand the gospel? He was a really nice boy, told little stories for kids, but not that bright when it came to other things. That's why the Apostle Paul came along and wrote complicated epistles to explain the gospel to us. Anyone here believe that? What Jesus does is actually much more interesting. What he does is he responds back with a question. The purpose of the question is to get the guy to open up within his general assumption. So he asks the question, why do you call me good? Now, why does Jesus ask that question? Well, in almost any culture, anywhere in the world, at any point in history, if you were to stop people at random and say, how do you get to heaven? Most people will say, well, be good, right? If you're good enough, you should go. So people will say things like, well, I can be good without God, so I don't need him. Or if I'm trying hard enough, that should be enough for him. So Jesus says, why do you call me good? And that's an interesting question, isn't it? What makes someone good? Then Jesus Christ answers his own question. Only God is good. Okay, let's run this together. If you have to be good to go to heaven, and only God is good, who is going? No one, apart from God. Your application to join the Trinity has just been refused. Okay, you don't meet the minimum entry requirement. Well, let's run it backwards. If only God is good and Jesus is good, then who is Jesus? God. Who alone can answer this question with authority? God. Jesus isn't playing games with this guy. Jesus is saying to this guy, there's a problem with your assumption that needs to be fixed first, because otherwise you won't hear what I'm saying. Look, let's suppose you invited me to go out for coffee with some of your friends. And you say, Michael, I've got a lot of friends. They don't believe any of this stuff. They'd love to ask you their difficult questions. And we all sit down with coffee, and I say, hey, guys, before you ask me any questions, I want to say something to you. I want to tell all of you that I know for sure I'm going to heaven. Now, how does that sound? Arrogant, self-righteous, presumption, and so on. When I say that, what does everybody hear? Right, okay, I'm good. As a matter of fact, not only am I good, I'm better than you. That's why God sent me here. Okay? To help you, I'm just so good, he sent me to tell you how bad you are and how you need to be better like me. That's what people hear. Is that the message of the gospel? No. But people hear it all the time, right? Or think they do. What we're saying is, hey, why do I know I'm going to heaven? And it's got nothing to do with the fact that I think I'm good. It's to do with the fact that Jesus Christ was willing to forgive. Make sense? So when I say I know I'm going to heaven, what I'm trying to say is, look, I know I've been forgiven. I'm no better than you or anyone else. But the forgiveness that God offers, I've just said, yes, I need to be forgiven. Forgive me. So Jesus starts off by challenging his, does that make sense? Asking questions challenges general assumptions. Secondly, asking questions challenges cultural assumptions. Now look, some questions are not generally true everywhere you go. They're only true in specific cultural settings. Now you can see an excellent example of this in Matthew 22. In Matthew 22, someone comes to Jesus and says, should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? Now there's an interesting question. What is the answer to that question? Should you pay your taxes? Yes. Okay, that's 5 people in this room think they should pay their taxes. So it's a simple question, right? Yes, pay your taxes. You didn't even hesitate to answer. When Jesus was asked that question, he doesn't simply say yes or no. Why? Well, the question is a trap. How do I know the question is a trap? Well, in Matthew 22:15 it says, and wanting to trap him in his words, they came to him and asked him the following question. And that's like a clue, isn't it? That's like a little hint that the question is a trap. But here's the next question. What's the trap? I mean, what on earth is the trap? Well, if you read Matthew 22:15, verse 15 onwards, you'll actually notice something. It says that a group of religious leaders wanted to trap Jesus in his words. And they have a very politically explosive question. The question is so politically explosive They don't even want to be around when the question is asked. So they gather some young men to themselves, and they say to the young men, you go to Jesus and you ask him this question. And they send the young guys off on their own. They stay behind. And they send the government with the young guys to be present when Jesus Christ answers the question. So they want the government officials in the room when Jesus answers this question. So why is this question so explosive? Well, the question is being asked by a group of Jewish people. The Jewish people have been oppressed by the Roman army. The Roman army is financed by the paying of taxes. So if you pay your taxes, you're financing the oppression of God's people. But surely that is morally wrong, isn't it? So they argued, in which case you shouldn't pay your taxes if you were truly holy. So do you see now why they think this is such a good question? They come to Jesus and they say, teacher, we know you're a man of integrity. Well, that's nice, isn't it? You speak the way of truth as it really is, they say to Jesus. Well, that's nice too. You aren't swayed by other men. You don't give in to peer pressure, they say. You notice all those compliments? You're a man of integrity. You speak the truth plainly. You don't give in to pressure from outside. Tell us then, should we pay our taxes or not? Now, the question appears to be about taxation, but the real question is actually about holiness. So Jesus asks for a coin, and when they give him a coin, he asks them two questions back to back. He says, whose head is on this coin and whose inscription? And they say, it's Caesar's. So then Jesus then says, then you give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and you give to God what is God's. Now, do you see how Jesus Christ has answered the question? Yes, you pay your taxes. That's what's required of you. But holiness is about giving to God what is rightfully his. Do you see how he's answered the question? Jesus Christ can't give a simple yes or no answer to that question. To answer yes or no is to miscommunicate to the people in the room. If Jesus were to say, yes, pay your taxes, they would say, so you too are prepared to morally compromise when you think your life is threatened then. But that's not what he's saying at all. Now, they're hoping he'll say, no, don't pay your taxes. Then the government can arrest him and put him in jail. And then the problem of Jesus Christ goes away. So the third thing that asking questions does is it helps define the issue. Very often as Christians, we're answering one question when people are asking a different one. Let's try to take a modern example of this. Let's take something entirely non-controversial like abortion. Okay, no controversy there. Imagine you're in a coffee shop here in Bermuda. You're having this amazing conversation with a friend. It's going so well. And then they go, wait a minute. You go to one of those evangelical churches, don't you? Tell me, do you think abortion is wrong? And they ask it in a loud voice, and everyone in the coffee shop hears the question. At that point, you hear a slight scraping of chairs as every chair in the room turns around to look at you. Now, the Bible says, as Christians, you are Christ's ambassador. So as the ambassador of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, you will now open your mouth and speak on his behalf. What are you going to say? Okay, so let's suppose you open your mouth and you say, yes, I think it's wrong. Now imagine you were to say that, and then you went to everyone in the coffee shop and gave them a piece of paper and asked them to write down on that piece of paper what they think of you. What words will they use to describe you? Judgmental? Intolerant? Hater? Bigoted? Closed-minded? And a whole bunch of four-letter words that you're too scared to use because you're all nice Christians. Okay. Let's supposing you then say to everybody, actually, no, it's not me that says it's wrong, it's God. Now, does that generally help? People fall on their knees and they say, wow, okay, how can I become a Christian then? Imagine you were to say to them, okay, well, write down on this piece of paper what you think about God who does this. Now, in the world's eyes, okay, in the eyes of the world, what is the issue of abortion fundamentally about? Right what? Right to choose. Okay, that's the question they're asking you. It's about right to choose. What do you call people in positions of power who take away other people's right to choose? Dictators? Tyrants? Despots? Fascists? When's the last time you sang a hymn that went like this? God, there's no fascist like you. You're the greatest oppressor who ever lived. We prostrate ourselves before your huge dictatorship, and we marvel at your oppression. Have you sung that recently? Look, if someone were to ask you an apparently simple question, and as a result of you giving what you think is a simple answer, people would conclude the opposite of what it like is to be a Christian, or the opposite of what God's character is, you have a problem with the question. For the Christian, what is the issue of abortion actually about? Life. So you're answering a question which they mean choice, you mean life. Now let's suppose you went onto the streets of Bermuda, you stopped people at random, and you said, I want to ask you a one question survey, it'll only take 15 seconds. And they go, okay, and you say to the average Bermudian, when does someone have the right to take an innocent person's life? What would most people say? Never, unless maybe they're talking to a tax collector, because I can see you don't like paying your taxes. So you're going to say never. That's 99% of the population are going to say that here. What's going on in that conversation? They're asking you a question about right to choose. You're answering a question about life. When does life begin? And the two things completely miss each other. They're asking one question, you're answering another. Now, sometimes as Christians we say, yeah, well, I just speak plainly and then I get persecuted for it. But we're not being persecuted for speaking plainly. We're being persecuted for being stupid sometimes. Look, please listen very carefully now. Giving the right answer to the wrong question is always wrong. Okay? Giving the right answer to the wrong question is always wrong. You have to define the issue. That's the fifth thing that asking questions does. It defines the issue. It defines what you're actually talking about. So if you want some homework from tonight, and you have to forgive me because I live in Oxford and I teach people and I set homework, so I'm telling you some. I would like you to think of a conversation that went disastrously wrong with a non-Christian. They got upset, angry, whatever it was. And I'd like you to revisit and think about it, and you're probably going to find something. What you'll probably discover is this, that as you reflect back on the conversation you had, they were talking about one thing and you were talking about something else. They kept repeating what they were saying and you kept repeating what you were saying in different ways, and you just went round and round in circles. Asking questions helps define the issue. What are we really talking about here? Now, the next thing that asking questions does is it also exposes motive. And not all of our motives are good. The reason why they asked Jesus Christ this question is they wanted to trap him in his words. If they wanted to trap him, sometimes they may want to simply trap you and make you look like a fool. The chances are, if you're asked a very simple question, and however you answer it, you're going to look like an idiot, there's something going wrong with the question. But there may also be something going wrong with the heart of the person asking. Now, getting to the motive of why someone asked is really important, and this is what we'll be doing in the second half of this evening. Let's take a big question like suffering. Someone says to you, why is there so much suffering in this world? Well, why might someone ask that question? Feel free to go all Pentecostal on me again and yell out, why? Why might someone ask you that question? That they're suffering themselves right now. Or, pardon? They're angry, and this seems like a very good way to put you in a difficult position. Or, okay, they know someone who's suffering and they're worried about them. Or, pardon? Okay, they're asking a question about God's moral character. If there is a loving God, how does it look like this? Or, well, I can keep going if you want. They're a high school student and they were set an essay to write, and this is actually the title, and they're wanting to see if you've got anything interesting to say. Or possibly they're interested in what you think and they'd actually like to know what the answer is. Now, why is the motive important then behind the question? Well, do you see how the motive changes the question? If someone's asking the question because they're really interested to know the answer, or they're in the middle of pain themselves, or they're mad and angry because someone they love is in pain, or because they're struggling about, is God actually good after all, or because they're in the process of writing a little research paper and they know you're a Christian and maybe you can help them write it. Those are 5 different conversations right there. Very often, sometimes people say to me, Michael, you love answering questions. Why don't you just publish a book with all the questions you most frequently get asked and all the best answers to give? And the answer is, well, it's very hard to do that because I don't know what the motive is of the person asking the question. The motive really changes the meaning of the question. Now, is anyone here involved either in consultancy business or do something like marriage counseling or something like that? Anyone here? 1, 2, 3. Anyone else? Okay, well, let me ask you guys a question. Why do you keep asking people questions even when you know what the problem is? Because you do, right? You keep asking people questions even when you know what the problem is. For whose benefit are you asking those questions? For theirs. We ask questions for at least 2 reasons. One, we want to find out what's really going on. And that's how we find out. That's how I find out what people's real questions are. I ask them lots of questions, and I listen to what they say, and then ask them a few more questions, and then I might say, well, are you thinking about this? And sometimes they say yes, and sometimes they say no, and that's how I learn. But sometimes I keep asking them questions because I need to help them see their own motive in this. It's very interesting. In Luke chapter 20, a group of very high-powered religious VIPs come to Jesus Christ to challenge him because he's causing trouble. He's been clearing out the temple and doing some unpopular stuff. So they come to him and they say to Jesus Christ, by whose authority are you doing these things? Now there's a good question, because Jesus could say, I'm so glad you asked, because as the Son of God, I have all the authority I need. Now that would be a nice answer to that question, right? But Jesus looks at them and he says, I will answer your question if you will answer mine. John the Baptist, whose authority did he have? And now this little group of religious VIPs, they walk off to the side and get into a small holy huddle. And they say, okay, we're in trouble now. If we say what we believe, that John the Baptist only had authority from men, the people will reject us because they think he had authority from heaven. But if we say John the Baptist had authority from heaven to keep the crowd happy, the people will say to us, why didn't you believe him then? So they come back and they say to Jesus, we don't know. Now, is it true? Is it true that they think they don't know? Now, they're wrong, but they think they do know. They're not being honest. So they lie to Jesus. Well, we don't know. Well, they think they do. And then Jesus says something very interesting to them. He says, you will not answer me, so I will not answer you. Jesus doesn't say, I don't know either. He calls them. You're not prepared to be honest with your own question? I can't help you. Whatever I say at this point, you will not hear or you will deliberately misunderstand. So we have to learn to ask questions to help expose people's motives too. Now, asking questions does a couple of other things as well. Asking questions also helps expose faulty logic. Let's come back to that taxation question. In the taxation question, what's happening is a certain type of faulty logic. It's called a faulty dilemma. It's called a complex question. What's a complex question? When I was about 7 years old, growing up in the Middle East, this question popped into my mind, and I thought I can have some fun with this question. And every break time, I went out into the playground, because we used to start school at 7 a.m. because the heat was so high in the Middle East. You started school early because you finished at 20 to 1, because the heat was so unbearable at that point. That's when school ended. So we started at 7 a.m. So we had a break at 9. And I'd go into the playground every time at 9. This will tell you what a horrible 7-year-old I was. And I would find 2 or 3 kids playing together, 7, 8-year-olds my age. And I'd pick on one of them and I'd say, can I ask you a yes or no question? And they would say, okay. And I would say, does your mother know you are stupid? Now, do you see the problem with the question? If they say yes, they're stupid and their mother knows. If they say no, they're still stupid, but their mother doesn't know. And if they say I don't know to try to get out of it, they're so stupid they don't even understand the question I'm asking them. Now that's what's called a complex question. You've taken 2 different issues and you've joined them together. You force someone to answer one on the basis of the other. The question you want to answer is what? Am I stupid? The answer is no, but I haven't asked it that way. I've asked, does your mother know you are stupid? No matter how you answer it, you look dumb. There's something wrong with the question. This is why giving the right answer to the wrong question is always wrong. If someone puts a question to you, and no matter how you answer it, you're going to look stupid, there's normally that kind of logical error going on. Now, we don't have time to do this now, but you can actually teach logic and fallacies from the scriptures. I used to teach philosophical logic at university. Teaching philosophical logic is the secular equivalent of speaking in tongues. The difference is that when you teach that kind of stuff, even angels can't understand what you're saying. Every type of logical fallacy that exists was used against either Jesus Christ or the disciples. If you read the 4 Gospels and the book of Acts, every type They employ various types of logical fallacy in order to trap them. If they use them against them, you're going to find yourself in the same boat. Which is why we have to just learn how to think clearly. Asking questions helps clarify the logic. Now, the last thing is that asking questions also helps ensure a conversation. Imagine someone came to you and said, okay, I've got 6 questions for you, and every time they asked a question, which takes about a sentence, you took 10 minutes to reply. That means in the space of 1 hour, they've said 6 sentences and you've spoken the rest of the time. Now, I don't know if any of you know anyone who can speak to you for an hour on the basis of 6 sentences. I'm telling you, if you know someone like that, whenever you see them walking down the high street, you disappear into whatever shop you're standing next to, because you don't have time for that. That is not an interesting conversation. Interesting conversations, they go backwards and forwards. It's two-way. Asking questions helps ensure conversation. And the very last thing that asking questions does is it helps people think. Thinking is not the enemy of the Christian faith. It's simply not. The difference between an argument and a discussion is that in arguments, people stop thinking. Have you ever noticed when people are arguing, they very often say something that they wish they hadn't said, and as soon as they say it, the first words out of your mouth are, I'm sorry I said that, I wasn't thinking. And that's the truth. You weren't thinking. If you were thinking, if your brain had been in gear, you never would have said it in the first place. Asking questions helps people think. This is why Jesus Christ uses so many questions. He asks over 147 questions in the 4 Gospels, and they're all brilliant ones. He's not playing games with people. So the first thing, if you only take away one thing from this whole evening, if you only remember one thing, what I want you to remember is this. The reason why Jesus Christ asked so many questions wasn't because he wanted to avoid answering people's questions. It was because he was trying to help answer people's questions. And all of us can learn to ask questions. Now, very often, when we talk about, as Christians, learning to think better about our faith and telling other people, we want to jump in with all the answers. But the first thing we need to do is learn to ask the questions first. We have to figure out what the questions are. Now, very quickly, and then we'll wrap this up because I want to move into for you to be able to ask questions. 4th main point. So that was point 3, subsection G, okay, that we just finished now. Okay? The rest of it now flows a bit more fast. 4th point. In your heart, set apart Christ as Lord. We talked about that. Always be prepared. We talked about that. To give an answer. We talked about that. For everyone who asks you for the reason. Now that word reason there is the Greek word logion, come from logos, logic. It means, well, it comes back to that why question. Why do you believe this? If you tell someone what you believe, the next question is, well, why do you believe it? Well, that's the reason. The question is not whether we ever use reasons to explain what we believe. The question is, are they good ones or bad ones? Now, the hard thing is when we come to give a reason, that word logion is also the word logos, word, because you use different words to explain the reason. Does that make sense? And that's where we as Christians, we often trip ourselves up. We sometimes use a language that no one else can understand. Have any of you ever seen the British TV comedy program called Yes Minister or Yes Prime Minister? Have any of you seen that? I loved watching that program when I was a little kid. Did any of you see the version where they wanted to ban smoking? The Prime Minister comes up with the idea that if he bans smoking, that it will save the National Health Service billions and billions of pounds, and so they should ban it. But actually, what they've done the maths, and they've realized that because smokers pay so much money in tax, the government collects this way more money in tax than it pays out in health benefits. So from an economic point of view, they want people to continue to die off at about the same rate. And so they're now trying to think, well, how do we help persuade the Prime Minister, to change his mind? And the head of the civil service, a guy called Sir Humphrey Appleby, sits in front of the Prime Minister and says, Prime Minister, although your proposal to ban smoking encompasses several concomitant benefits of a marginal peripheral relevance, there are countervailing considerations of an infinitely superior and ultimately overwhelming significance, which goes to reveal that and would bring about public revelations and recriminations of profoundly embarrassing and ultimately indefensible character if you were to do this. Now, did you understand that? Now, all of those words actually exist. They're all in the dictionary. And he uses them all in the correct grammatical way. It's just, we can't follow it. So here's your second piece of homework. You weren't expecting to get so much homework, were you? It's coming here. If you're a Christian, I'd like you to, at some point, take a piece of paper and write down the 10 words you would have to use if someone said to you, well, what is this Christian gospel then? What are those 10 words? What are the 10 words that you would use all the time to explain the gospel? And when you've written those words down, I need to go and find some non-Christian friends. If you don't have any non-Christian friends, then you need to make some. If you can't do that, then imagine you have some and imagine what they might say. God's given you an imagination, so you may as well use it. What you want to ask everybody is, what do these words mean to you? Because the words that we use often mean something very different to the other people we're talking to. Words like love, goodness, God, forgiveness, and so on. Whatever words you want to use, what does that word mean to the people you're talking to? And you need to be able to figure out the difference between the two. So we have to be able to be clear with our language and with the reason. Fifthly, in your heart set apart Christ as Lord, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you for the reason for the hope. So here's the fifth thing. Why do Christians have hope? Remember the advice I gave you earlier. His name begins with J. Okay, right. His name is Jesus. The reason why Christians have hope is because of the life, death, resurrection, and the coming again of Jesus Christ. That is the reason why we have hope. We don't have hope because we've got better philosophy, morality, theology, or anything else. We have hope because of him. That means all of our answers either flow to or flow from ultimately the cross of Christ. What is the connection between Christ's death on the cross and why we have life now? That is we have to help people see that. D.T. Niles, who was a theologian in Sri Lanka, he used to give the following illustration. He said, look, let's suppose you're walking through the jungle and a tiger jumps out to eat you. And all of a sudden, from nowhere, a man appears. He starts fighting the tiger and you manage to escape. Okay? The man dies and you live. Out of respect, you go to his funeral. And as they're lowering him into the ground, the priest looks at you and says, the man we're burying today died so you can live. And he points at you. Well, D.T. Niles said, you would understand that, right? That would mean something to you. D.T. Niles said, supposing you're walking through a jungle. A man from nowhere, a tiger jumps out to eat you. A man jumps out of the jungle too, climbs on top of a well, jumps down the well and drowns at the bottom of the well. You beat off the tiger and you escape. Out of respect, because you were there, you go to the man's funeral. And as they're burying the man, the priest looks at you and says, the man we're burying today died so you could live. Now, does that make any sense to you? No. Because you're thinking, what on earth is the connection between this guy drowning at the bottom of the well and me having life? Right? So when we say to people, Jesus Christ died so you can live, the most logical question is what? What's the connection between his death on the cross 2,000 years ago and me having life today? That's a good question, right? So we need to be able to answer it. How do we connect people to the hope that we have? Now, lastly, we'll run all of this together. Peter says when we give an answer, we need to do it with gentleness, respect, and keeping a clear conscience. We do it with gentleness, okay? Because we're not interested in beating people up and trying to prove that they're wrong and we're right. We want to actually connect with them and understand who they are. We do it with respect. We actually treat them in the way that we would want to be treated ourselves. And we keep a clear conscience. We don't lie to them. Okay? We don't tell them things which aren't true. Now, this is what we have here in these few verses is, if you like, a model that we begin to use then to share our faith. Whatever we do it with gentleness, we do it with respect, and we do it with a clear conscience. But we all start with trying to learn what the questions are. What are the questions that we should be asking as other people ask us questions? How do we actually understand where people are coming from so we can connect, ultimately, whatever it is that we do say with what it is that they're actually asking? And when those two things are connected, well, now we're actually all on the same page. Several years ago now, we were doing one of these training events, and at the end of it, a 28-year-old woman came up to me, and she said, Michael, I live in a country where there are hardly any Christians. And Christians are quite badly persecuted in that country. She said, I work for the family that more or less owns my country. She says, and so as a result of this training, when I go home, I'm going to start asking them questions. But I'm worried that as they speak with me, I may get stuck. She said, would you mind if you gave me your cell phone number, and if I get stuck, I'll ask them to give you a ring? And I thought about it and said, well, I guess I can't say no to that. So I said, okay, look, here's my number. Well, I heard nothing for 9 months. 9 months later, I was in Holland speaking to 900 Iranians. And about an hour before I was getting ready to speak to them, my phone rang. And I picked up the phone, and someone introduced themselves so quickly, I didn't hear their name. And then immediately launched into this conversation. Now, I don't know if you've ever been on the phone with someone, and you can't recognize their voice, but you're now several minutes into the conversation. You can't say to them, sorry, who are you exactly? Because that's rude, right? So I'm just desperately praying, thinking, who are you, and how come you have my cell phone number? Okay, and then he suddenly says something, and I think, I know who you are. You're the friend of this woman. So we spend the next hour on the phone, and I basically just ask him questions all the way through. And after about an hour, his voice begins to break on the other end of the line, and he says, you know what? He says, I've met with presidents and I've met with prime ministers, and I'm searching for the ocean. He said, I've looked into their eyes, and all I see are dirty little puddles. He said, I know you're a busy guy, but if you will just tell me a country I can meet you in, I will fly there if you'll give me 3 hours of your time. So we agreed on a location, and we sat down for breakfast. And at the end of 3 hours, he said, I want you to come to my country and tell the rulers of my country what you have told me. And so I said, well, why would the rulers of your country listen to me? And he said, well, we own the country. Of course they come when we invite them. So I was like, okay. He said, the next time you're in the region, he says, give me a ring. I'll bring you to the country. So about 6 months later, I'm in the region, and I ring this guy up, and I say, how are you doing? I say, I'm not very far away from you. I'm a couple of countries away. Would you like to talk? He says, yes. He says, go to the airport. He says, go to our national airline desk tomorrow. He says, there'll be a ticket waiting for you. Okay, pick it up, come here. We'll spend 2 days together in my country, and then at the end of 2 days, I'll give you another ticket, and you can fly home. And I thought, okay. So the next day, I went to the airport, and I went up to the airline desk, and I said, excuse me, would you have a ticket for Michael? And they're like, oh, yes, yeah, sure we do. Seat 1A, first class. I was like, oh, nice. And they asked for my passport, and as they flicked through my passport several times, and then they look at me and say, where's the visa? I was like, I need a visa to go? And they're like, yes. I said, you know what? I didn't even think about that. I said, I'm sure it will be okay. And they said, no visa, no entry. And I said, look, just let me on the plane. It will be fine. Well, an hour later, I'm now getting ready to go on the plane, except this time the person checking my passport has a gun. And he flicks through my passport, and he says, where's your visa? And I said, well, I don't have one, but it will be fine. He says, I can't let you on the plane without a visa. So I talked to him for a while, and I persuade him to let me on the airplane. That's what I do, right? I'm an evangelist apologist. I persuade people. So I get on the plane, and we're now flying to this country, and I'm about 2-3 hours into the flight, and a couple of thoughts suddenly occur to me. Number one, this country has one of the worst human rights records that there is. People just disappear and never heard of again. Number two, trying to enter a country without a valid visa is actually a serious legal issue. And number three, for the life of me, I only can remember my friend's first name and not his last name. So what I would like to say is, as I was on the airplane, I found myself praying, saying, Lord, everything's going to be fine. I trust you. That's what I would like to say I prayed. What I actually prayed went like this. God, please don't let me be arrested. I've got a credit card. I'm not even asking for a miracle. Just let me use my credit card. When I land and I get into trouble, I'll deport myself. I'll buy a ticket to England directly from the airport, and airports are international territory, right? So technically you don't enter the country till you leave the airport. So I was saying, look, I don't even want them to deport me. I'll deport myself. Just please, Lord, allow me to use my credit card to buy myself out of this mess I've got myself into. And there may have been some tears involved in this prayer. Anyway, as I landed, I walked off the plane, and it was just about coming up for daybreak. And as I walked down the steps, there's a car waiting, and there were two guys. And have any of you seen the Blues Brothers? Black suits, black ties, and dark glasses. And it's still not even light yet. And as I walk down the steps, they look at me and they say, "Are you Michael Ramsden?" And I was so tempted to sort of, "Oh, I think he's, you know." And I said, "Yes." They said, "You have to come with us." So they put me in the car and they drive me off to a little building somewhere. And they give me a cup of tea, and then they come back and they say, "Where's your visa?" And I said, "Well, look, I don't have one, and I'm about to launch into my whole, I'll deport myself out of your country." One of them looks at the other one and says, "Wake up the Minister for Interior, get him down here to put the visa in." So I had to wait 20 minutes, and I don't think he was very happy about being dragged out of bed. But anyway, I then entered the country. Now, for the next 2 days, the guy looked after me from beginning to end. We met with all kinds of people. He wouldn't let me pay for anything. On the last day, on the third day, as I was getting ready to fly back home, we were sitting in the airport, and it was getting late. I hadn't checked in for my flight, and it was coming up for about 40 minutes before departure, and that's normally like a crucial marker. And I'm thinking, I need to make this plane. I'm not going to tell my wife I've missed the flight. So I said to him, I said, "Look, you've been so kind to me. Thank you for everything you've done. I've loved being with you. Allow me to pay for the tea, because you paid for everything else, and then I'll just go check in and I'll go home, because I don't want to miss the plane." And the guy looked at me and he said, "The plane will leave when I say it can leave." I was like, "Okay." I said, "Well, let me just pay for the tea." He says, "No, I can't allow you to do that, because if you pay for the tea, you insult me, you insult my name, and you insult my family." So I said to him, "How can I insult you, your name, and your family by paying for the tea?" And at the end of the tea bag, there was like a little label. And he held up the label and says, "You see this label?" I said, "Yes." He says, "I own this company. This is my tea. You cannot pay for my tea in my country. That would be an insult to me, because you are my guest." So I was like, "Okay." Anyway, about after another 20 minutes, he said, "Okay, let's go." And we didn't have to bother with any formalities. We didn't even get boarding cards. We just walked straight up onto the plane. And he came and sat next to me. And I looked at him and I said, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "Well, it's a 6.5-hour flight back to the UK. I may as well fly with you so we can keep talking." He says, "Then I'll just come back." I was like, "Okay." The girl who opened up that country for the gospel was 28 years old. How do you think he would like to use you? She was willing to put her neck and her life on the line in order to try to open things up for something to happen. And that's what she did. There are all kinds of people with questions out there. They're wrestling with them and they're struggling with them. If Jesus Christ is the Son of God, you would expect the most meaningful and insightful response to whatever it is that they're asking and saying would come from him. And he's given you and I the privilege of trying to speak for him, which is why we want to do it as well as we can. And the best place to start is by looking at how he did it himself, and then trying to also figure out what are the questions we need to ask, and then even before we move into, well, what are the kinds of things we ultimately need to say. Do you mind if I just briefly pray for you as we draw this part to a close and move into the second bit? Okay. Father, I want to pray for every person who is in this room. Lord, I know that you love every single one of them, and you indeed even know the questions of their own heart. Lord, issues which they struggle with, or they see others struggling with around them. Father, I want to pray, Lord, that you would give us all the strength and the courage and the ability that we need in order to take something that just brings so much life and hope, Lord, and share it wherever we go in a way that really pleases you and honors you and helps people see you. Because, Father, more than anything else, we want people to see Jesus and to welcome him into their hearts in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, now we get the second bit. Now this gets more interesting. I asked you at the beginning of this session, do you remember? What is the question you would least like to be asked? So here's what I suggest we're going to do. For the next 30 minutes or so, I'd like to try to gather in as many of those questions as I can. Now, it's going to work slightly differently, because I'm not going to be standing here just simply answering your questions. What we're going to be doing is trying to apply what I said at the beginning now into those questions. So I need those questions to use as examples with you. All right? So, how many people have actually written down a tough, difficult, hard to answer question that they think is just a hard one to deal with? Have we got any of those? And my suggestion is just, if you've got one, hold it up in the air, and some people are going to walk down the aisles and we'll collect in those questions, and then we're going to take some of the hardest ones, and we're going to try and deal with them. So there's one here. Anybody else? Okay. There's one there at the back. Okay. This is good. If you don't have many questions, I get to leave early, which is nice, because then I have an early bed. I need a lot of beauty sleep. With a face like mine, it's a big requirement. Any other questions? Yeah? Okay. I think there may be another one just here. Okay. So chances are we probably have enough questions to be getting along with. So if you want to just bring them up here, here's what we'll do. Jesus. Okay. All right. Now what I want to try and do is I'm going to try and take Jesus was gone. Okay. Why did God save some, not others? Okay. All right. All right. Now. Okay. Let's just have a look here. I want you to try to remember some of these questions. I'm going to read them out. All right? This is it. Why does God save some people and not others? What happens to people who died before Jesus Christ came? Okay. If God knows the end from the beginning, how is there any form of free will? Unbelievers ask, how many people have you brought to Christ? That's an easy one. Yeah. Okay. Let's just have a look here. We've got just some. If Adam and Eve were perfect, why did they sin? What gives you the right to tell me I'll go to hell if I don't believe in Jesus? There's a good question. Okay. Now here's what I would like you. Let's just take those ones, and we'll come back to some of these other ones too. So I want you to try and remember there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions. I'm going to read out these 5 questions. I'm going to give everybody here in this room 3 votes. Okay, so after I read out these 5 questions, I'm going to read them out one at a time, and I would like you to vote, okay, 3 times for the questions that you would most like to discuss next. Okay? Now, you may be tempted to vote more than 3 times, okay, in which case, remember, God will judge you and hold you to account, okay, for what you did tonight. And then we're going to use those questions, and then we're going to explore a little of them together, and we're going to go backwards and forwards a little bit. Okay? So let me just read the questions slowly so you can remember what they are. What gives you the right to tell me if I will go to hell? The right to be told, I will go to hell if I don't believe in Jesus. If Adam and Eve were perfect, why did they sin? If God knows the end from the beginning, how is there free will? What happens to people who died before Jesus came? Why does God save some and not others? Okay. Can you roughly remember those? 5 questions. I know it's late at night. Okay. By a show of hands, we're going to just try and figure out what is the benefit. What gives you the right to tell me I will go to hell if I don't believe in Jesus? How many people would like to see that one? Okay. All right. That's quite a lot of you. If Adam and Eve were perfect, why did they sin? Okay, that's a few of you. If God knows the end from the beginning, how is there free will? Okay, it looks like we were predestined to answer that one. What happens to people who died before Jesus came? Okay, slightly less. And why does God save some and not others? Okay, so here we got our 3 questions. All right. So here's what I'd like you just to do for a moment. And hopefully everybody will be able to do this. I'd like you to sort of just, we'll take 2, and I'm going to split the room roughly in half, okay? So if you think you're to the right of me, my right, well, it actually doesn't matter, actually, because I'm going to split the room in half. So if you're to the right of me, I would like you to get into groups of 3 and 4, and I would like you to take the question, why does God save some people and not others? And I'd like you, within your group, to try to think of 3, 4, 5 different reasons why someone might ask that question. What could be the motivating factor driving that question? Does that make sense? So think of 3 or 4 or 5 different reasons. Now, if you're to the left of me, I would like you to take the question, what gives you the right to tell me I'll go to hell if I don't believe in Jesus? And again, in groups of 3, 4, 5, doesn't really matter. I would like you just to take a couple of minutes and talk amongst yourselves and say, why might someone say that? What could be driving them, does that make sense, to ask you that question? Are you with me? Okay, so we'll just do those 2 bits first. Okay, so you literally got like 2-3 minutes to come up with anything from 3 to 5 reasons. Okay, so and the 2 questions are, why does God save some and not others, and what gives you the right to tell me I'll go to hell? Which is different to someone saying, look, how can you be speaking to me about this when I know all the mistakes that you've made? So can you see how the question radically changes? Okay, it's not the same question. So if we really want to engage with people, we need to figure out what is the question you're asking? Does that make sense? What question do you mean? Which of those is it? Now let's just come on to the other side. Your question was, why does God save some and not others? Now, so let's just come and take some of the reasons there. God's not fair. Okay, so they're asking a question about fairness. Surely there should be fairness here. And how can this possibly be fair? It seems to be, some get selected and some don't. That doesn't seem right. Okay, if God is really powerful, why doesn't he just save everybody? I mean, surely that's possible for him. Okay, right, maybe they're thinking about their own salvation. They're thinking, look, I'm not actually sure where I stand in all of this. And that's what they actually mean by the question. What about me? Well, he doesn't seem to have picked me. Okay? Okay, right. Maybe they're comparing it with other faiths, and they're thinking, you know what, other faiths don't seem to have this problem, but you do, so your faith is inferior to their faith. Okay, maybe they don't believe in God at all, and what they're basically trying to show is that maybe what you believe is really stupid. Okay, God seems to have favorites. Now, let me just say something at this point. You may notice between some of the reasons we've said on this side of the room and some of the reasons we've said on this side of the room that a lot of what we're talking about here, a lot of the reasons you're giving me are moral complaints about God. Did you hear that? Is God fair? Is he just? Does he have favorites? Surely he can do something about this, and he's choosing not to do it. Most people's problem with faith in God is moral. Whether you're a believer or a non-believer, most real questions that really bother us, does that make sense? They are moral complaints about God's character. God, are you fair? Are you just? Are you right? That's the biggest group of questions by far. Now, the next biggest group of questions are moral complaints about the church. But the ones about God are the biggest, and they are very important. Why are they important? They're important because you can't put your faith in someone, you can't put your trust in someone if you think that they are morally wrong. Does that make sense? So you wouldn't trust me if you thought I was a deeply morally flawed being. Does that make sense? If you were going on holiday, you wouldn't say, here are the keys to my house, can you look after it for me? Okay? You would want to know that you could trust me. Well, if you're talking about trusting your whole life and eternity to God, you want to be pretty sure about his moral character, right? Now, the reason why I'm highlighting this is if most people's primary struggle with God is moral, what must any answer do, therefore? It must answer the moral question. If any answer you give in no way addresses that moral concern, they're going to feel that you haven't answered it for them. Now, you can now get back into your groups, because guess what the next bit is? How are we going to discern amongst all of those possible reasons on both sides of the room which is the right one? What are you going to do? Ask a question. So, I want you to get back in your groups and think of maybe 2 or 3 questions you could ask to help figure out where they're coming from. But the one question you can't ask is, why are you asking me that? Now, why do I say that? Because if you're talking to someone, having coffee with them, and every time they say something, you say, why do you say that? It's going to sound strange. Now, you already have some idea what they could be saying. Does that make sense? So I'd like to try to think of the questions that will really draw out of them where they may be coming from. Now, we live in such an age of confusion, we sometimes feel a question, but we don't know why. Does that make sense? I don't know if you've ever had that. Sometimes, if you ever look at a problem and it just looks very confusing and you're having a problem describing it, if someone comes and describes the problem for you and they do it well, you go, that's it. You've nailed it. That's exactly it. And we love that person just because they help clarify our question. Does that make sense? So if you can think through the questions which actually give, in essence, sort of expression to maybe some of these motives to help draw out of them where they're really coming from, that will bring clarity to them. That makes sense? Clarity to their question. What are the kinds of questions you could ask that would hopefully get them going, yeah, that's it. Or even, no, that's not it at all. That second response is just as helpful as the first. I remember once speaking to a business guy in Hong Kong. He asked if he would meet with me after he heard me talk. And it was a very scary, I have to say, very, very scary. He said, I'll pick you up from your hotel and I'll drive you to this restaurant. And we almost died at least 12 times while he was driving me. And I can remember, you talk about praying hard. I was praying. And after about 15 minutes, I looked at him at one point thinking, okay, we almost died again. And he obviously noticed me looking at him. And he said, I normally have a chauffeur. He said, I haven't driven in 18 years, to be honest. This is my daughter's car. He said, but I wanted to talk to you privately without him listening in, so I decided I'll drive you. And I'm sitting thinking, we're dead. There's a lot of water. It's a bit like here. There's water everywhere. I thought we were going to go into the sea and just go to the bottom. Anyway, after he finished talking at me for an hour and a half, we're now safely ensconced with a cup of tea, and I'm sort of trying not to calm my nerves a little bit. And I look at him and I said, because I wasn't sure what he was, even after an hour and a half of listening to him, I thought, what are you telling me exactly? So I said, well, are you asking me this? And he went, so that's again like a subtle body language hint that wasn't it. So then I said, well, sometimes this happens and this happens in life and it makes us ask this question. He went. So then I tried a third time. And the third time he suddenly leant forward and just looked at me and I thought, okay, third time, I've got it. Okay, this is what we're talking about now. Okay, what are the questions you could ask in a sense that would help bring that clarity? So get back into your group. You've got 2-3 minutes again. Let's see if we can come up with some questions together. Okay, let's now draw on the collective wisdom of the room. Okay, so let's do the why does God save some, not others? That's this side here? Okay. So, questions. What did you come up with? Okay. What do you mean by save? Now, there's a great question. Now, why is that a good question? Because they're now going to explain to you, in a sense, what they think by a word that you yourself often want to use when you're explaining the gospel. Does that make sense? And you're going to find out, well, what do they think? What do they believe? It'll tell you what they think the gospel is. Then you can hear whether that's actually right or whether that's actually wrong. And it may also give you some idea about where they're coming from. Does that make sense? You know, their background and their history and so on. So that's a great question. How about another one? Okay, what do you think would be fair? Yeah. Okay, so now again, that's going to come back and put the ball back in their court where they're going to explain, you know, what they think they either know about the Christian faith or what they actually do believe. And again, you're now going to find out more about where they're coming from, why they believe, what they believe, and so on. So that's great. Pardon? Okay, you could try asking them, you know, who do you think God is? Okay, in all of this. And they might say, well, that's what I'm trying to say. I don't think there is a God. The whole thing seems utterly ridiculous to me. So they're actually an atheist. Does that make sense if that's the answer to their question? And so actually, the real conversation you need to be having is, well, does God actually exist or not? Does that make sense? That's a different question to the one they asked. Very often, the question that people really want to have answered is sometimes buried a couple of questions back. But they don't necessarily know it because we don't talk about this stuff all the time. Does that make sense? So if you're used to talking about it a lot, then of course you're used to thinking about things and you say, actually, maybe it's more useful to go here. But if you don't do it that often, it can sometimes feel confusing. So the question which is asked well is going to bring clarity. Look, you will know if you've got the question right, because if the person you're talking to smiles and says, yeah, that's a really good question, that helps. If they shake their head and look at you like you're crazy, then ask another one. Okay? Any others? Okay. Oh, okay. Why does God save someone? Are you thinking of someone specific? Okay. Now, there's an interesting question. Right? And again, it's going to tell you, you want to hear something about their background, their life, their story. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. Any others? Okay. Can I ask you what your experience with other Christians is? You know, or you know, have you asked other Christians this question before? And that's going to tell you something too. Because if they say, yeah, I ask this question all the time and no one can ever answer it for me, what does that tell you? Well, that tells you that this question really bothers them. Does that make sense? They really mean this. This is a big question for them. But if they go, no, not really, then actually, maybe they're not that interested in the answer. Now, why is that important to know? How many of you ever, I don't know, been out for a drink with someone who don't know that very well? They mention something, and you say, oh, I didn't know you were interested in computers. And then you got like a 1.5 hour description about, you know, the latest Intel processing chip. Has that ever happened to you? And you're sitting thinking, I really wasn't that interested. I was just, I was just trying to be nice. So you genuinely want to find out, do people feel they have an ownership over that question? If they do, then great, talk with them about it. But actually, if they don't, then there's no point. Does that make sense? Jumping in at that point, they're not interested. Anything else? Are you worried that God's not going to save you? Okay, so now you're bringing it back. Now the advantage of that is that it's easier for someone to talk about themselves than other people. So sometimes we ask questions thinking of other people, but then we're trying to guess what other people think and feel. It's much easier when we're actually talking about ourselves because we know we should have a better idea about what we think and feel. Okay, do you believe that God is good? So you're pushing it back into that whole fairness thing. Okay, is God really fair in all of this? Yeah. Okay, right. Okay, if does God exist, what do you think is going to get you in? Right? And again, that's going to tell you something about what they actually think. Let's just come over to the what gives you the right to tell me I'm going to hell question. Oh, one hand went straight up at the back there. Okay, right. Do you believe in hell? All right, that's going to answer the question about, is this something that they're worried about? Is it just something that they conceptually object to? And so on. It's going to be, it gets them talking. It's a great question.
I thought, is the issue
Okay, right. Is this a personal question for you? Okay, and again, that question is helpful because it helps you answer the thing. How important is this question to you? Make sense? Okay, right, okay. Is there an issue for you in trying to define what hell is? Yeah. Okay? Okay, right. In your opinion, who would have the right to make that kind of decision? All right, that's a good question, and that will again help you understand what they believe. Yeah, at the very back.
Do you believe people have a choice?
Okay, okay. Do you think people have any choice in this issue? Again, that's going to help you understand what do they think, what do they believe, and so on. Yeah? Okay, do you hear me calling you a bad person? And they may say, absolutely. You know, when I first started talking to people about Jesus after I became a Christian, one thing I got very good at, or had to get good at, was apologizing to people. I'll be talking to them, and you could see from their body language that they weren't happy with what I was saying. And I'd stop and I would just say, can I just ask you to say back to me what you just heard me say? And they would then tell me what they heard me say, and I can put my hand on my heart and say 99 times out of 100, I could look them straight in the eye and say, you know what, I'm so sorry. I wasn't trying to say that at all. I was trying to say something really very different. And then very often after that, they'll look at me and they'll say, well, if you're not saying that, what are you saying then? Does that make sense? And so now I have to think, okay, let me try to say this in a different way, because I tried saying it this way, and you heard something I didn't want you to hear at all. So let me try saying it in another way. And then as you do that, if you suddenly find a way that clicks with people and they get it, well, are there any teachers in the room? Anyone teach? Yeah, that's a noble profession. But if you find a great way to explain something with one kid, what do? If you see the lights come on in their eyes and they finally get it when they've been struggling for ages, the next time someone struggles, you think, well, let me try that explanation. It really seemed to help the other person I talked to, and you try it again. If it keeps working all the time, then you may use it all the time. If it doesn't work all the time, you think, it was really helpful for them, but I need something different to help here. And you just learn. Yeah, go on at the back. Okay, do you think there is a need to be saved? Now that's a great question, because they could say, no, not at all. I think I'm fine. What's wrong with you Christians? Why are you so negative about human beings? I can remember once I was actually doing a session like this in a church in Africa, and this guy came up to me at the end and he said, look, I'm not sure I was invited here. He says, I'm a non-believer. I don't believe any of this, and you seem to be training people how to tell people about Jesus. I was like, yeah, that's the purpose of the evening. And he said, but you got me thinking, because I have a lot of questions. And I said, okay. I said, I'm going to be back here in about 10 days' time. I'll be passing back through the city. Would you like to meet up? And he said, sure. So 10 days later, I was in the city, and I had his number. I rang him. I said, how do I find your house? And I came and visited him. And I sat down in his house, and he pulled out a sheet of paper, and it had 24 questions on it. And he handed me and said, here you go. These are the questions I want you to answer. So I handed him back the sheet of paper, and I said, there are 24 questions here. Are there some more important? Do you want to pick out one or two in particular? Because we won't have time to do 24. He said, no, just start at the beginning and let's see how far we get. Question number 6 was a very profound question. In question number 6, he said, you talked about the importance of forgiving other people. He says, do you know how hard it is to forgive yourself, let alone to forgive someone else? And I said to him, wow, I said, that's a very honest question. It is hard to forgive ourselves at times. I said, do you mind telling me what it is? He said, no, I'm not prepared to tell you that. So we talked about the fact that we all have things that we're deeply ashamed of and areas where we failed. And the incredible thing about God is when he offers us forgiveness, he doesn't do it out of ignorance. God doesn't offer to forgive us not knowing what we've done wrong. He offers to forgive us knowing what we have done wrong. Does that make sense? Which means that the forgiveness he offers is total. Does that make sense? So very often, if we do something bad against somebody, we only tell them so much of what we've done, because if we told them everything, they'll hate us forever. So we tell them just enough to forgive us. Right? But then we live in fear of being discovered. Does that make sense? What happens if the other bit comes out? But that's not how forgiveness with God works. God knows everything. He knows exactly what we've done. So when he says, I forgive you, it's not out of ignorance. Does that make sense? He knows more than we're even prepared to admit. And he went, you know what, I said, and if God can forgive you that way, having been forgiven by God is the basis on which you learn to forgive yourself. And then you also learn to forgive other people. He said, that makes sense. Question number 7 was, I'm a good person, why do I need Jesus? So I said, well, what do you mean by that? He said, well, I'm basically good, I'm fine. I said, what are you struggling with in question number 6 that you're not prepared to tell me about? He said, no, I'm not prepared to tell you about that, but apart from that, I'm good. I said, really? I said, okay, so apart from the one thing you don't want to tell me something else that you've done that you wish you hadn't done. He said, no, I'm not prepared to tell you that either. And it took 10 minutes, and after 10 minutes, he went, yeah, okay, I'm not a good person. So sometimes asking those questions, that makes sense, just helps get people to the point of at least being able to recognize the reality of the situation of their own heart. Now, because time is clicking on and we've only done 2 of these questions so far, you may notice we haven't done anything yet, which is even move towards an answer. And the reason is, well, depending on what the question actually means and depending where they're actually coming from, is going to completely then dictate what kind of response you give. So what's been the purpose of this whole evening? Well, let me suggest some things to you in case you can't think of one. God is actually interested in using you to talk and engage with other people. But as Christians, we haven't necessarily always been very good at listening to other people. So we struggle to understand what the questions actually are at times. There was a Christian thinker by the name of Francis Schaeffer, and he lamented. He said the trouble with seminaries, where they train pastors, is not that the people who graduate don't know the answers. They know the answers. The trouble is they don't know what the questions are. So we have to start with, well, what are the real questions? Does that make sense? What are the questions that people have? So if you listen to the music that people listen to, if you read the books that people are reading, you listen to the news programs they listen to, you will eventually figure out what are the questions they're wrestling with. We have to start with figuring out what are the questions they're asking. The next thing is, what does that question mean? Does that make sense? Why is that question important to you? Because if the question's important to you, you're connected to it. So I want to understand why this question is so important to you, because then I can begin to try to think of an answer that may meet it. Otherwise, I might be answering some other question. I may have a good answer, but that answers this over here. Let me end with a little illustration. Several years ago, I was trying to sort out some pension provision, retirement plan for all the staff that we have working for us in our UK office. And I went down to London to go and talk with somebody, and I jumped into the back of a taxi cab. And in England, they have this amazing taxi cab system where they do this thing called the knowledge. It takes 3 years. They have to learn every single street in London. They have to know the location of every hotel, every hospital, every museum, every monument. So you don't need an address. You just say, take me to X, and they just drive you there, okay, in a city with 15 million people in it. I mean, it's amazing. That's why it takes 3 years to do the knowledge. So I jumped into the back of the cab, and I had a female taxi cab driver, and I told her, can you take me to X? And she went, sure. She started driving, and as she drove off, she started talking to me. That's not unusual, cab drivers talk, except she could talk with no input from me. So I just sat in the back of the cab going, yeah, okay, like that for about 20 minutes. And she started to, for whatever reason, started to tell me her whole life story, which was interesting. And she talked about the fact that she was about 20 minutes in, and then she said a line. She said, I had a guy in the back of my cab yesterday who worked for Goldman Sachs, and my ears pricked up because I have a brother who works for that bank. And she said, I asked him if he was married, and he said, no, I'm not married. And I said, why aren't you married? And he said, because if someone marries me, it'll be because of my money, and then they'll divorce me to take half of my money, and I don't want to lose half of my money, so I decided never to get married. And at this point, she'd been talking so much, she had to stop for air. And so I said the first sentence I said since I got in the back of the cab. I just said, oh, that's sad. I'm sad to hear that. And she looked at me in her mirror, and she said, I used to be married. She said, my husband and I were both cab drivers. We used to work the night shift because that's where the fares go up. She said, that's where you get the most money. She said, we bought a ramshackle old house in England, because we saved up, and then we started renovating it. And she says, we redid the kitchen, we redid the bathrooms, we redid the living room, we built a nice big patio outside, we built an outdoor barbecue, and I started smiling. Because when I first moved to England from the Middle East, the first thing I did in my house was I built an outdoor barbecue. Of course, it's England. You never can use it. It's always raining. My theory about this is that we build them in England as like monuments to hope. We look out the window and think, hey, one day I will be able to use that thing. And then she said, and we finally had the house that I'd always dreamed of having, but I wasn't happy. And she said, that's when I fell in love with the guy who sold fruit and vegetables in my local market, and I've been living with him for the last 6 years. So I just said to her, I said, well, are you happy now? And she said, no. She said, I used to think there was something wrong with my husband, but now I'm beginning to think there's something wrong with me. So I said, because she was in her 50s, I said, tell me, when you went to school, did you have to do religious education? Because it used to be compulsory. And she said, yeah, I did that. I said, did you ever read the Sermon on the Mount? You know, blessed are the poor, blessed are those who mourn, and so on. She said, yeah, I did. I said, do you know what the word blessed means? And she said, I haven't got a clue. I said, well, it's a hard word to explain it. It means like life joy. It means like a kind of joy and satisfaction that goes beyond the outside, right to the very core of who you are. And she said, she looked at me and she said, well, do you know that kind of joy? And I said, there was a writer called G.K. Chesterton, and he said before he became a Christian, he experienced happiness on the outside of his existence, but there was a sadness at the center of it. But ever since he became a Christian, there was a joy at the center of his existence, even though he knew suffering and pain all the way around the edges of it. I said, that would be true for me too. And we arrived at the destination, and she sort of leant over and looked at me, and she says, do you mind if I ask you a few more questions? And I said, that's fine. And she left her meter running. Now, I know in the Bible it says you shouldn't seek to make a profit from sharing the gospel, but this woman's charging me to share it with her, so that's a whole other deal. Now, what was interesting was, just a week before, I'd been talking with someone else, and they said something very similar to me. I think there's now something wrong with me. And when I was in the back of the taxi cab, I was so tempted to jump in, does that make sense? And say what I'd said a week before. But as I was there, I just remember praying, thinking, I just need to hear a little bit more from you. I'm not sure I need to say the same thing that I said last time. I would try and encourage all of you. It is so worthwhile trying to have those conversations with people. It takes a lot of practice, I've discovered. The more questions you ask, the more naturally it comes and the easier it becomes. And the more time you spend listening to people, the easier it sometimes comes also to recognize what sometimes people are going through. Partly because you've now heard it so many times before in so many different ways, you think, and you say to them, well, are you feeling like this and this? Is that what you're struggling with? And they say, yeah, that's it exactly. And then you're thinking, okay, at least now I know where we are. So now that's the point we can talk with. There are all kinds of opportunities that pass before us every single day, and we often miss them. What 1 Peter 3 is talking about is saying, look, don't miss that opportunity. Okay, when people are asking those questions, even if it comes in the form of a statement, learn to recognize what it is, make the time to hear what they're saying, and then try to figure out what it is that Jesus Christ has to say that's going to make all the difference in that person's heart and life. Jesus didn't come to solve a problem we do not face, and he didn't come to answer a question that no one's actually asking. Very often, the questions that we start with aren't really the questions we mean. And what happens as you talk with people is the question itself begins to change, and eventually you arrive at the question that they themselves actually really have, even if up until that point they never actually realized it. And that begins to change the entire way then in which you begin to talk with people. Well, look, I know we've only even just started to scratch the surface here. You probably could have realized from this, given how little ground we've covered, that there's a huge amount of stuff to do. Now, I am aware of the fact that there was a question about predestination that I haven't got to that you all voted to select. So maybe we were predestined not to answer it. Let me just say this. I have actually written a small article on free will and predestination that's available on our RZIM website. It's called, Did You Choose to Read This Article? Okay, so if this is a question that's really bugging you, okay, why don't you get online? It's only about 6 pages long. You can download it and read it and see if that actually helps. Otherwise, you've all sacrificed your Saturday evening to come out to listen to some strange guy from halfway around the world come and talk to you. And while I've enjoyed myself, you may not have done. But I was glad that you came, otherwise I'll just be here on my own. And this is nowhere near as fun when you're just on your own. So thank you for being here. I really hope it's helpful. If you want to find out more about the RZIM Academy, that's like a series of online modules we do. The first module, I think, is 16 talks long. The first one is the one that I've just given here. And then the next 15 help unpack it and apply it all the way through, except all the other speakers who give the talks are better than me. So, and I say, if you want to find out more about who RZIM is, what our organization, and any kind of resources that you think we may have, or any way we may be able to help or serve you, if you do come and talk to Bob or Jim at the front, they'll be more than happy to help you. Otherwise, enjoy your evening, have a good night's sleep, If I don't get to see any of you again, it's been wonderful being here. For those of you who come to church here and will be forced to listen to me tomorrow morning, I'm very, very sorry. Please forgive me. You have to forgive me, you're all believers. And I look forward to being with you tomorrow morning. Otherwise, God bless you and thank you for coming.